As the Second World War came to an end, the true crimes of the Nazi regime would become unveiled. As the Allies captured more territory and liberated many different concentration camps, it would be the Red Army who liberated the largest Nazi concentration camp, Auschwitz, on the 27th of January, 1945. Within the walls, over 1 million people had been murdered, and over 7,000 prisoners remained, left behind at the camp. The crimes that would be uncovered following Auschwitz's liberation, and the liberation of the other camps, would shock the world and cement the Third Reich as one of the most evil regimes ever to have existed. After the Second World War had drawn to a conclusion in Europe, a number of the perpetrators of the Holocaust were brought to justice. One of these men was Rudolf Höss, the longest-serving commandant of Auschwitz. He would finally succumb to justice himself in 1947, inside his own former camp. Join us today as we look at the justified execution of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz. Remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Rudolf Höss would join the Nazi Party in 1922 following a speech from Hitler in Munich, and he would participate in brutal acts under the guise of the party. He would be part of a group who beat a schoolteacher to death, a man Martin Bormann wished dead. But Höss was tried as a ringleader and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was known for being a rather violent man. After his release, he married and had 5 children. Höss had become acquainted with Heinrich Himmler and joined the SS on the 1st of April, 1934, moving to the Death's Head unit. Höss would idolize Himmler, and he even preferred the head of the SS to Hitler himself. Höss was first assigned to Dachau concentration camp in December 1934 and would work there as a block leader. After promotion within the SS to captain, he would become an adjutant to Hermann Baranowski at Sachsenhausen, who was involved in the leadership of the camp. At Sachsenhausen, he would lead the firing squad. It would be Höss who led the execution of August Dickmann, the first conscientious objector to be executed after the war began, on the 15th of September, 1939. Höss even fired the finishing, deadly shot from his pistol. He would then transfer to the Waffen-SS in 1939 after the Germans invaded Poland. He was highly thought of within this organization and recommended for promotion. On the 1st of May, 1940, Höss would begin the role for which he would be most famous. He was appointed commandant to a prison camp in western Poland. The camp had been built around an old army barracks and was named Auschwitz. Höss would go on to command the camp for 3 years, and he turned the camp into a huge, expansive complex known as Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. He had been briefed to create a transition camp for 10,000 prisoners from the existing buildings, but he had different ideas. He wanted to create the most efficient camp he could, certainly more efficient than what he had seen in the past. Höss would even move into Auschwitz himself, inside a villa, along with his wife and children. Despite his horrific work in organizing mass murder, he lived a relatively normal home life. Auschwitz, at its peak, would be made up of 3 different facilities, and it was served by many subcamps. The whole camp was built on around 20,000 acres, with Auschwitz I being the main administrative center, Auschwitz I Birkenau being the extermination camp, and Auschwitz I Monowitz being the slave labor camp for German industrial conglomerates. Höss would secretly meet with Himmler in June 1941 after hearing about the order for the final solution. Himmler had chosen Höss's camp, Auschwitz, for the extermination of Europe's Jewish population due to its easy access by rail and also because of the huge site that had been set up. The project was described as secret, and Höss began to develop and test different ways of massacring as many people as possible in the most efficient way. Auschwitz would become the most efficient instrument in the Holocaust, and the camp would develop further to become even more efficient in its methods of killing. Höss would experiment with different methods of gassing prisoners in order to kill the most people as quickly as he could. During his reign as commandant, he would oversee the deaths of hundreds of thousands. After his arrest, he would state, "I myself never knew the total number, and I have nothing to help me arrive at an estimate. I can only remember the figures involved in the larger actions. From Upper Silesia and the general government, 250,000. Germany, 100,000. Holland, 95,000. Belgium, 20,000.
France, 110,000.
Greece, 65,000. Hungary, 400,000. And Slovakia, 90,000. This brings his total of killings to 1.1 million. He would then say, "I can no longer remember the figures for the smaller actions. I regard a total of 2.5 million deaths as far too high." Even Auschwitz had its limits to its destructive capabilities. Höss would be removed from Auschwitz in 1943 after he had an affair with an inmate, and this could have resulted in him being relieved from command. He would return on the 8th of May, 1944 to oversee Operation Höss, in which 430,000 Hungarian Jews were transported to Auschwitz and executed in just 56 days. The sheer number and volume was so huge that the camp struggled logistically to deal with the genocide, with thousands of bodies being burned in open pits. Höss would then finish his career at Ravensbrück, organizing the evacuation of prisoners within that camp. He would be arrested in March 1946, despite attempting to bite a cyanide pill, and he would be called to testify at the Nuremberg Trials, being called as a defense witness by the lawyer of Ernst Kaltenbrunner. He would reveal that he estimated 2.5 million were executed at Auschwitz during his time in command of the camp, with the figure representing around 70 to 80% of all those who were sent to the camp. Whilst he was accused of murdering 3.5 million people, he said, "Not only 2.5 million. The rest died from disease and starvation." Höss would be handed over to the Polish authorities, who would try him for murder. Whilst in prison, he would write about his experiences, and he would write how he had been mistreated by the British whilst held in captivity. During his trial, he was calm and controlled, and he knew what fate would await him at the end of the trial. He would ask to send his wedding ring to his wife, and the court would announce its verdict, sentencing Höss to death by hanging on April 2, 1947. The day after the verdict was passed, former prisoners of Auschwitz would ask the court for the execution of Rudolf Höss to take place on the grounds of his own concentration camp. It was scheduled for the 14th of April, however, it had to be postponed, as it was feared that local residents would attempt to lynch Höss when he was being taken to his site of execution. Instead, the date of his execution was moved back to the 16th of April. The gallows had been made by German prisoners of war, with a trapdoor fitted into it. Höss arrived at Auschwitz for his execution at 8 a.m. and was taken to the building that once housed his office. He asked for a cup of coffee, and after he had finished, he was taken to a cell in Block 11, the death block of Auschwitz. At 10 o'clock, he was led out to his execution. He was calm and strolled confidently throughout the camp he had once overseen, and he walked towards the gallows. His hands were handcuffed and restrained behind his back, and the executioners had to help him climb onto a stool, which had been placed above the trapdoor. A priest, Father Zaremba, approached Höss, who stood on the stool, and then the prosecutor read out the sentence. The executioner then placed the noose around Höss's neck. Höss adjusted it with a movement of his head, and then the hangman pulled out the stool from below the former commandant of Auschwitz. His body struck the trapdoor, which opened, and Höss was left hanging. The priest began to recite a prayer for the condemned and dying. The execution occurred at 10:08 a.m., and at 10:21, he was pronounced dead by a physician. Höss was probably cremated, with his remains being scattered in an unknown location. Höss, for days before his execution, would realize the huge crimes he had committed, writing, "As commandant of Auschwitz, I was responsible for carrying out part of the cruel plans of the Third Reich for human destruction." It was this human destruction that was placed in the forefront of his mind when he came to expand and rule over one of the most inhumane and despicable places on earth, Auschwitz. He was an intensely cruel man whose crimes and legacy would write him in the history books as one of the most evil men in the history of the Holocaust. Rudolf Höss would finally get his comeuppance in the place in which he inflicted so much horror and suffering onto the world. Thank you for watching. To uncover more hidden stories from the war, please subscribe to The Hidden Past.